Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. This is going to be great.
It should be, yeah. I'm a big fan of the topic, though I'm very much an amateur, so it's good to be with something of an expert. Um, I guess the first question I just want to start off with is a simple one, but one that I'm really interested in, or I'm really interested in your answer for. Why do you love art, and how did you first fall in love with it?
Well, that's a good question that I don't think gets asked enough. The way I fell in love with it was living in Paris when I was 16 years old. And so I had a sort of weird high school experience. I went to an old boarding school in the US called Choate, and they had abroad
Yeah.
programs like universities do. And I went on a study abroad program lived in Paris when I was 16. And it was just the best time ever. I loved it. It was like a big sleepover party. There were 15 of us Choate students, and we were each living with a different French family, speaking only French there. And every afternoon from 2 to 4 p.m., we would go to a museum on a field trip with the art history professor. And it's
Hmm.
much easier to be engaged with art if you're in person rather than, in a dark hall watching a slideshow. And I
Right.
thought this was great, but at first I thought this is cool, but I want to be Indiana Jones. And
Hmm.
that's actually what I wrote my entrance essay to go to college about. And then I
Yeah.
realized that archaeology isn't exactly like the movies. A lot of dusting of unrecognizable things and a little chemistry, and I thought it was not for me. So art history felt like the easier step forward. It's also good because you wind up studying everything, three-dimensionally, 360 degrees around an object. So if history is about events or people, this is about physical objects and the stories behind them and the context for which they were made and through which they existed. And so to me, that's fascinating, and it's sort of a cheat because it means you can study everything um, through these objects without having to pick a subject.
Right. Right. It's funny that you bring this up, the fact that you were 16 in Paris and that you went to Choate. I had a very similar story. I went to Lawrenceville. I'm actually going to Lawrenceville later
Okay,
today to teach. And when
sweet.
I was 16, I moved to Paris alone, and just sort of
Wow.
lived there. Over the summer was my freshman
That's
year
awesome.
summer.
Wow.
I went there. I think nominally I was there to like take some like French cinema classes or French literature classes, like a bunch of smattering of French classes. But the truth of it was I didn't spend that much time in class. I spent most of my time in bars and cafes and museums. The Musée de Laundering, I absolutely loved.
Hmm.
That was one of my first entrees into like scandal and intrigue in the art world. So that was cool. But it's funny to hear
That's a
you.
really weird coincidence, man. That's wild.
Yeah, I honestly, maybe I should have read up more about you, but I had no idea. So that's funny. Um, I guess and I agree with what you're saying about seeing art in person. It is very much a different kind of experience to like be there with the art in conversation with the art, like rather than looking at it on a screen, or looking at it in the printed pages of a book. Um, art can, or sculpture in particular, I've found can really just like stare you down, capture you. But anyway,
Absolutely.
I want to go ahead. Sorry.
There's a vibe that you get when you're in front of a work of art that you don't get through the slides. And I always say that some of the digital images that we can have access to now are remarkable from a scholarly perspective. Like I have a whole book about the Ghent altarpiece, which I've seen in person many times, but when you're in person, it's behind this, bulletproof glass and you can't get close than about 1.5 meters away. And there's a billion pixel digital image that's freely accessible online. And in it, I was able to spot a figure I had never seen in person. And I wouldn't really be able to
Hmm.
see in person. So sometimes it can make breakthroughs, but you just don't have the vibe. And what I like in particular is an art pilgrimage to see a single work of art that I'm excited about that I have to make a journey to. So all these great
Right.
universal museums are cool, but then you're seeing, you can see 2,000 objects in one space. But I like the single, destination object that is in some remote church that I have to journey to. That's my favorite way to approach it.
Yeah. Where is the ambassadors hanging? The Hans Holbein the Younger painting with the skull.
That's at the National Gallery in London. And when I did a master's at the Corto Institute in London, I was visiting it all the time. And also my favorite painting, Bronzino's Allegory of Love and Lust, is in the same museum. So that was like my hometown favorite. For more than a year, I would go in many times a week. It was really special to be able to spend so much time there.
And the other thing it gets me thinking about is, I have no idea whether this is true or not, but someone once told me that the Mona Lisa, which I've had the great fortune of being able to see in person once, was like changed 3 times a day. It's sitting there behind the bulletproof glass. I don't know if it's whether the Mona Lisa or something else. Do paintings ever rotate between 2 like high quality replicas or forgeries and the real one to prevent against like theft?
Yeah, it's a good question. Not the way you're thinking of it. But one thing that surprised me is I gave a talk at the Albertina in Vienna a couple years ago in support of my book, The Art of Forgery. And I was all excited to see the Albrecht Dürer drawings and paintings. Oh, man, extra credit. You got it. Very good. So I was giving a talk in support of this, and I was all excited to see the Dürer drawings and watercolors. And I went to see them in the gallery, and when I saw them, I thought something was funny, but I wasn't quite sure what. And then I found the wall copy, which was sort of hidden away. They were being a little bit sneaky. And it explained that only once for 6 months every 4 years are the originals on display. And at all other times, they have high-quality replicas because prolonged exposure to light would deteriorate them. So I had been all excited to go speak at this museum to see the very works that were not on display. And I actually came back a few years later because I live now in Central Europe, not that far away, when there was a special exhibit. And every 4 years, people come to see the originals, which are otherwise in storage. So that sort of thing happens, and museums should really be quite transparent and overt about it, and they aren't always. I'm not sure I would have bought a ticket to the Albertina had I known that the things that I wanted to see were only there in replicas. But in terms of what you're talking about with like rotating Mona Lisa, that doesn't happen. That's made up. But it makes for a good story.
Yeah, I remember when I was a teenager, not long before I jetted myself over to Paris. I used to watch White Collar. It's a TV show with Matt Bomer, and it's there's all kinds of like conspiracies and scandals and such. But it was like, obviously it's exaggerated and over the top and more than anything fictional. But as a teenager, it was a great entry for me into learning who Modigliani was and to learning what a codex was and all this other stuff.
Sure.
Just watching it as a 15-year-old. So I hold on.
It's a show I've never seen,
head.
but everyone tells me I should see it. I can't.
You
can't
would
believe
probably
I haven't
like
gotten
it.
to it yet. Yeah,
you might
I'm
like
sure.
it. It's a little like cheeky and maybe beneath your pay grade, or I don't know how much of the
I love that stuff.
creative embellishment you could live with. But I enjoyed it when I was a teenager. I want to talk to about the minds, motives, and methods of master forgers, as you have subtitled The Art of Forgery. So the tagline in the book, sort of on I have it. I have the book. The tagline in the book is that, the world wants to be deceived, so let it be deceived. We love to be fooled. We love to have, something pulled over on us, to have wool pulled over our eyes, and then, to have like the trick revealed or maybe not revealed. But I'm just curious, like, why is that? Why do we like to be fooled? Not necessarily just in art, but why do we have such appreciation for those who can like pull one over on us?
Well, I think every human culture and mythology, in the pantheon, there's a trickster, whether they're human or semi-human or divine, a Loki-like figure. And their source of fear combined with admiration, because you don't want to be the one who is fooled in a way that ruins you or embarrasses you. But if you are hearing about someone else's embarrassment or ruin, we like that. And then we also like it if we are volunteering to be fooled because we're in a situation where we know that something is going to happen that's unexpected, that's going to invert our expectations. We also have an admiration for magic, whether you are a believer in magic or whether it's about like sleight of hand and illusionism of a stage magician. That undermining of our expectations and creating a situation that we can't immediately explain away is pleasurable. And we're trying to figure out a puzzle. It's the same reason we like detective stories and whodunits. As long as we're not the one being killed, then we think it's intriguing to try to solve these puzzles. And so I think it's part of that. You know, I own some forgeries. I don't know if you can see on my wall over here. There's two engravings that are kind of fun. One on the left actually appears in the book. It's the Marc Antonio Raimondi forgery of an Albrecht Dürer print. And the other one is Albrecht Dürer's Melancholia 1. An original one sells for, 6 figures. This is not an original one, but it was made from the original plates, and it was printed by the German state in the 1930s. And these are available for more like normal human prices, but it looks exactly the same as one that was printed during his lifetime. And many of these have been sold as originals, and this will cost you, I don't know, $2,000, and the original will cost you like $200,000. So it's a completely different ballgame. And for me, that's fun to have because I know the story behind them. If I had paid $200,000 for that one and it turned out to be worth $2,000, I would not be happy sharing the story with you. So there's this appreciation for, others being fooled, particularly when there's a class divide. So this is something I talk about in the book, but especially in cultures like England, where there's very much a system of social classes, it's hugely popular to see the elite cut down to size and shown as being foolish. And that is the narrative in so much of the media representations of forgery stories. So that's basically Schadenfreude, the German term for, pleasure at the misery of others.
Yes. Yeah. Happiness at others' misfortune. I think of, Figaro, the marriage of Figaro is just like ridiculing the upper class, the nobles, in a very clever, creative way. And to your point about the 2,000 versus 200,000 point, I would, or I don't know if I would take issue with that. I have a counter example. I know a guy who, he had a Picasso on his wall. And he was having a cocktail party. This story was passed on to me from someone who's very close to me. He had a Picasso in his living room, and they had a cocktail party one night. They invited a bunch of friends, and one of the guys who came there was like a Noah Charney type, like a real like art world motherfucker. Like this guy knew his stuff. I don't know if he was actually an authenticator, but he was, he had a seat at the big boys table in the art world. When they're, sitting around drinking scotch, or wine or whatever they were drinking. And he casually leaned over to the partner of this person that I know and said, hey, listen, I'm not going to ruin the party. I'm not going to bring this up, but you might want to have this Picasso authenticated. Like you might want to, have it looked into. And the girl, naturally ran straight to the host and said, her partner, and was like, her boyfriend, husband was like, hey, you need to hear what this guy just said. And the guy's like, no, I don't want to, the art guy was like, no, I don't want to, ruin the party or anything. But the guy's like, no, it's a party. We're drinking. Tell me. And he goes, look, that painting is a forgery. I can tell you right now, it's not real for XYZ reason.
Mhm.
And the host just laughed a little bit, chuckled, and said, listen, for what I paid for it, it's real to me. Like, I like looking at it. I paid a shitload of money for it, and it accomplishes all that I want or need it to accomplish. So on some level, I don't give a shit whether it came out of Picasso's hand or not. I bought it branded as a Picasso. But now, whether it's real or not, it hangs in my living room. I see it every day. I like looking at it. So I'm not going to get it authenticated because it doesn't matter to me.
That's a good story, and I've heard some similar things. A lot of people will, one hand, he sounds very confident. A lot of people will be basically ashamed at having been fooled or at finding out that they were fooled, so they'd rather not know. But it reminds me of a case study of the Wakker Van Goghs in a most famous trial, early trial that involved forensic investigation in Amsterdam in the 1930s with a series of paintings ostensibly by Van Gogh that were brought into question because the people who acquired them had conflicting opinions from the two leading Van Gogh scholars of the time, a guy named H.P. Bremmer and a guy named Bart de la Faye. And if the experts had agreed, then there would have been no question, but they couldn't agree on 5 of these Van Goghs that came from this mysterious collection. And in the end of the trial, it was determined that all 5 of them were forgeries. And one of them was owned by a wealthy American collector named Chester Dale, who has a wing of the National Gallery in D.C. named after him because he donated to have it built. And he said, as long as I'm alive, this is by Van Gogh. And that was the end of the story. He didn't want to hear about it. And you have similar things, with like the Shroud of Turin, which 4 separate scientific labs have identified as a 13th century painting, a forgery meant to look like a religious relic. And a 13th century bishop had said this is a forgery. But, it doesn't stop people from believing in it. Millions of people come to visit. So the power of belief can overcome scientific fact. We see this just beyond the art world. We see this, in politics, in science, in belief, in creationism, you name it. So this is a human thing that we don't like to be proven wrong. We don't like to have demonstrated that we backed like the wrong horse in the race. So we're willing to be very stubborn to prove to ourselves that we were right all along.
Right. This dichotomy is interesting too between, on the one hand, wanting to be fooled in certain circumstances, and on the other hand, stubbornly and obstinately refusing to admit when we were wrong. Maybe, as you said before, we like it when it happens to our buddies, but not when it happens to ourselves. I think too of, this idea of real to me, like it's real to me, or someone says that's not real. And I go, it's real to me. And that's all that matters. There's this, I've done a lot of research on or writing about research, thinking about con men, imposters, people who sort of assume the identity of other people, like Martin Guerre, for example, is a French guy. James Arthur Hogue was this 28-year-old dude who was a serial petty drifter, and he pretended that he was a teenager and applied to Princeton using bogus credentials in the 90s. And he got in and he killed it, and took 7 classes at a time, got straight A's, and it was interesting. And there's all these other Ivy League imposters, Akash Maharaj is one, Lon Grammer is another. But on the subject of Hogue, David Samuels is a writer. He's been on this podcast actually. He wrote this book called it was a New York article that became a book called The Runner, because James Hogue was also on the track team. And one of the lines in the book was that he was a ghost who became a vector for the myths and dreams or whatever of everybody else. And when he was exposed, he went back to being a ghost. So I was writing about this, thinking about this, and it's like people say James, his pseudonym at Princeton was Alexi Indri Santana. People say, well, Alexi was never real. Alexi never existed. But he did exist in like the hearts and minds of people who knew him. And a painting that's fake does exist. This fake Picasso does exist in my close friend's living room. And it's real to him. So it's a question of like what's real and what's not. Maybe it's a personal, there is no universal thing. One thing that's real to one person, like a religious belief, for example. My religious beliefs, not that I have too many, can be very real to me, but not necessarily to you.
Absolutely, yeah. And forgeries especially, they are all actual objects. Although the latest variations are things like NFT forgeries, where the original isn't actually an object, the forgery isn't either. But yeah, in most cases, traditionally they are objects. Some of them are very beautifully done, and they have stories to them too. They have biographies. They've been believed in or not, and they have a value, especially ones that are not mechanically reproduced but are made by an artist. They are original objects in derivative imitation of the style or an exact work by another artist, but they're still original and they can be very beautiful. Just like you go to museums, you see art students copying works in the museum, which is legal to do. It only becomes illegal if you try to commit fraud by passing it off as something more valuable than it is. Those are all legitimate objects too that can have their own stories and people can love them or hate them. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I think too of American Hustle. Have you seen the film?
I did, yeah.
David O. Russell. Yeah, and there's that line in the film. They're looking at a painting that's hanging in a museum, and it's like this. You see this painting here. People come from all over the world to see this painting, but it's a forgery. And the line that really sticks with me is, people believe what they want to believe, which is very true. We convince ourselves of all kinds of bullshit all the time. We're like,
of course,
we're the best con men because we're able to con ourselves into, like, you're the best con men are able to con themselves into believing their own bullshit. It's like people believe what they want to believe. Anyway, we can move past. This is all very like high level, surface level stuff. Maybe time to move into a more focused line of questioning, which relates to what motivates a person to actually go and become an art forger, other than the obvious monetary benefits. You've written about the whole like chip on your shoulder paradox, or the whole like, redemptive or redemption aspect, and then there's the like getting back at the art establishment for somehow rejecting you. But like one thing that sticks out to me, this guy David Samuels, who I mentioned before, also wrote a long piece for the New Yorker about the Pink Panther diamond thieves. They steal precious gems all over Europe. And one of their motivating fact, these were all guys who came out of like the Yugoslav wars, like ex-Serbian paramilitary guys. And one of their motivations for like plundering, I mean, that's not really the appropriate verb. They're not plundering. They were stealing from like high-end jewel stores. But one of their motivations for like plundering these jewel stores in Western Europe was that like Eastern Europe got the butt end of the stick. So there's this, or they felt that they were like left out of the growth that happened afterwards. So there's this like getting back at factor, or this like chip on your shoulder thing. That's not forgery at all, but it's just, I'm thinking about like the redemptive aspect. So Noah, why would a person who can, sell ice cream or t-shirts or books or coffee decide to go, or, become a teacher or do anything else, decide to go out and become an art forger? What are the motivations?
Well, I looked at about 150 case studies for this book and chose to include about 60 of them. And out of all the case studies I looked at, the vast majority had the same psychological profile and initial motivation for turning to forgery. Now, most of the people who turned to forgery became forgers, meaning that they did forgery regularly for an extended period of time because they were making money off of it. But the initial motivation for almost all of them was a passive-aggressive revenge against the art community, which they saw as this sort of private club to which they weren't invited. Now, why they saw that change from person to person. Some of them were not admitted to an art academy. Some of them were unable to make a living as an artist creating their own originals. That's the story for most of them. And decided that they wanted to demonstrate how great an artist they really were. Another person was fooled by an art gallery that bought an object he found at a flea market for a medium amount of money, and he was quite pleased, but then he saw that he had been tricked and they sold it for a huge amount of money afterwards. So all of this has to do with a sense that I'm not welcome at your party. I would quite like to be considered part of like the art world, and I'm going to show you how foolish you are to have overlooked
rejected me.
And this passive aggressive revenge has a sort of double whammy. So the first one is, if I create a work of art and you, the experts, think that it's by a famous artist, that lets me rationalize that I must be as good as the famous artist in question. And it also lets me laugh at those stupid experts who can't tell the difference. Yeah. Now, there's a logical disconnect between the two. If they're so stupid they can't tell the difference, then it discounts the value of my being thought of as having created something that a famous artist did. But I don't think they're thinking that deeply. So that's the initial, high that they're getting. And this revenge that's passive aggressive, where they're the only one in the world who knows about it, is not sufficient for a lot of these forgers. It's like if you actually have the Mona Lisa in your living room and the original is there, and you snuck a forgery into the Louvre and you can't tell anyone about it, not everyone is satisfied with that private victory. And so an astonishing number of forgers we know of volunteered that they were forgers, or they basically, if you put them on an analyst's couch, they let themselves be caught, because the actual completion of their revenge only comes when they go public, because the foolishness of the experts has not been revealed. The experts haven't been made foolish to anyone except the forger. So, I always say that my History of Forgery book is a history of failed or voluntarily failed forgers, because we know about them. And there's probably another world of forgers who we don't know about because they've been satisfied with that private victory.
Right. There's an old, it's not even a joke, I would say to my friends sometimes, is a, cocktail napkin line in a bar, like, who's the greatest art forger of the 20th century? And, some people who were into art would like rattle off some names, and I'd be like, no. We don't know who it was because they were never caught.
Yeah. That exactly, yeah.
Yeah. But it's interesting to think like what motivates a person. I mean, do you think that this is a particularly healthy outlet for their resentment for having not been let into the club?
Yeah, it depends who you ask. Hitler was also not let into the club. He wanted to become an art student or an artist in Austria, and he had a rather more destructive outlet. So I'll take the lesser of evils. The passive aggressive nature of the revenge. The fact also, one of the reasons that I write about art crime all the time, but our forgery is in its own book, is because it tends to function independently of organized crime, and the people involved in it tend not to be career criminals and haven't been involved in other sorts of crimes. So from a criminological perspective, it's distinct, it's much less serious, and it's more like, I think I have a line in the book that I'm always quoting, the forgers are more prankster than gangster, and they think of themselves as like pulling the wool. It's like a Jackass episode, pulling the wool over the eyes of the elite, and not really doing any significant damage. And criminologically, that's sort of true. Usually it is wealthy individuals or institutions who are suddenly in possession of something that is worth much less than they thought, but it's not going to be their ruination. Yeah. And the forgers are non-violent, and because they're not usually linked to other crime types, it's more innocuous when it comes to crimes. I guess it's a crime that it's like okay to find intriguing. And if you're going to go for a beer with a criminal, you'd probably rather go with a forger than, someone more objectionable.
Right. Like Hitler. I mean, you say like it's the lesser of two evils. I don't necessarily see it as an evil thing, but I mean, to your point about crime, art, or maybe I'll ask, to what extent does forgery play into the sort of criminal underworld of, like, whether it's real art or art forgery, funding, I don't know, like bad shit, like terrorism or people hiding money and keeping the art in like whatever free ports, and it's just another kind of asset. It's another way of moving money. So to what extent is art used in like bad shit, like terrorism or, I don't know, drug trafficking or whatever?
Art crime is a significant funding source for bad shit. The forgery is much less so.
What do you mean art crime? Forgery. What is a funding source for bad shit?
Sure. So when I teach the history of art crime, I look at different categories, forgery being just one of them. So the most serious thing in terms of the extent of it, how difficult it is to police, and how it funds bad things is illicit trade in antiquities.
Right.
So this is usually taking antiquities directly out of the earth in unofficial excavations that are not supervised by archaeologists. And that is by far the biggest problem. The objects that are taken have never existed before for modern humans, so we have no idea what to look for. And they can be sold on an open market or a gray market like online auction houses with forged paperwork that make them appear legal. And then they can be sold for something approaching the full price. And there have demonstrably been a funding source for terrorist groups. ISIS is the most obvious example. They were, showcasing it all over the internet. But we've known about this since 2007, at least, when at the Interpol Stolen Works of Art annual conference, there was a presentation given about the links between art and terrorist funding, particularly illicit trade of antiquities and fundamentalist Islamic terrorist groups. There's a really good documentary that shows how this works behind the scenes called Blood Antiques by a Belgian company called Journeyman Pictures. Yeah. Okay. And back in 2004, Der Spiegel in Germany broke the news that Mohammed Atta, who was one of the architects of the 9/11 attacks, had initially flown to Germany with Polaroids of looted antiquities that he was looking to sell. And when he was asked what he wanted to sell them for, he said to buy an airplane. And one of his early iterations of the 9/11 attack would have been to buy airplanes with funds generated by selling looted antiquities and then to crash those planes into buildings. And the hijacking option was a later iteration of the same plot. So it is very bad. And the majority of art crime, meaning art theft and illicit trade in antiquities in particular, setting aside forgery, it involves organized crime groups at some point in the life of the crime, whether they're actually doing the stealing or smuggling or fencing. Organized crime groups are almost inevitably involved, to the point where it's easier to count the instances where they're not, where you have a lone thief, someone who's kleptomaniacal, or a pair, like a couple working together who are not otherwise linked to organized crime groups. That's much easier to name those instances because almost everything is linked to organized crime in some capacity, meaning that it's funding and fueling other activities, criminal activities that are more objectionable to the average person on the street, like the drugs and arms trades. And it wasn't long ago that the U.S. Department of Justice and Interpol were quoting that art crime was the third highest grossing criminal trade worldwide, behind only the drug and arms trades. They've since taken that statistic down, and in various footnotes, it now says we don't have enough statistics to be, we don't have enough empirical data to be certain about this, but suffice to say it's among the highest grossing, and has to be taken seriously whether or not you like art because of its importance in funding criminal activities.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, is there a direct link between actual... I understand, like, doctoring the paperwork, like altering the provenance or creating phony badges of legitimate sale or whatever. I mean, that's bad. The Nazis did that left and right. That most of the stuff that was sold off in Lucerne in 37, I think, ended up with fake paperwork down the line. But is there an overlap, Noah, between like fake paintings, like forgeries, and the bad shit, or is it just that like art itself is sometimes used as a vehicle of transfer, of asset transfer?
There are not many cases where an identified forgery has been used for money laundering or something like that. What happens more often is that legitimate art is used to launder dirty money. The forgery aspect is more to do with insurance scams, for example. But if we're talking about serious financial crime, let's say that you have stolen, you've robbed a bank and you have all this cash sitting around that's hot. And you need to convert it into something that's of roughly the same value, but that is not hot, that doesn't have traceable serial numbers. And so what you can do is you can buy real estate or art, and art is harder to seize, easier to hide, easier to move. So you go and you spend, $1 million in cash on a painting, and you have a painting legitimately. The buyer is not asking where you got the money from. Maybe they should. Maybe in some countries there's legislation that says over a certain amount you need to, but in most cases they don't. And then you have this painting that's of the same value, and you can move it around or hold on to it, or you can sell it, and then you're presumably getting non-dirty money for it. So that sort of stuff happens with alarming regularity. It happens for individuals, companies, banks. They invest in art. Where the money comes from that they're buying the art with is sometimes questionable.
Right. No, it's fascinating, and you're absolutely right. A painting is much easier to move than a big house somewhere, or any other form of real estate. No, have you read this book? Are you familiar with the book Provenance by Lainey Salisbury and Ali Sujo?
Sure, yeah. It's about John
what's it
Myatt.
About? Okay.
It's about John Myatt, who's one of the case studies in the art of forgery. He's a really lovely guy. I bet he would be on your show. He does this sort of thing quite a lot. He's really friendly. Here, his wife writes back to their website email address. And Provenance is basically telling his story. But the term provenance, not all your listeners may be familiar with. It means the documented history of an object. So anytime that object has been referenced in archival material, documents, photographs, that provides proof of its existence, and the more provenance that you have supporting the long-term existence and authenticity of an object, the more reassured buyers are that it is what you claim it to be. So basically, if for hundreds of people, everybody thought that the painting in question is by, let's say, Raphael, and it's been written about in books and cited, and it's appeared in exhibitions and in gallery catalogs, that would reassure a potential buyer today that it's authentic. So when an object comes onto the market, then the researcher who is assigned it will look for provenance, will look to fill in as much of the backstory as possible. And the cleverest forgers will use a version of what I call the provenance trap, and there are 5 versions of it that I talk about in the book that are basically taking advantage of the fact that scholars are hungry for provenance to fill in the backstory of an object that they would like to sell. Right. And they tend to overlook details that they probably shouldn't if the story behind the object is compelling enough.
Yeah.
So this
People.
book is the story of John Myatt, who used one version of the Provenance trap, and is a very interesting, charming, talented guy. And you showed me the cover of my book. Well, he very kindly let us use his forgery, we'll call it. He calls them genuine fakes because you can now pay him a lot of money to make you a work of art in the style of any artist you like. The mirror image on the cover, one is Vermeer's girl with a pearl earring, and one is John Myatt's girl with a pearl earring.
I thought it was the same. I'll have to look at
Aha, that's great. Okay, that's fun. Yeah, turn it upside down, and you'll see that it's pretty good, but it's not exactly the same.
It's a bit different. You know, if I were painting it, maybe I would have made a few different touches, but I'll accept it. It's passable. It's passable. How did the I'm just kidding. How did it's very good. How did the Nazis fake provenance, Noah?
Well, the Nazis are its own complicated.
Tell me about like the sale in Switzerland in Lucerne in 1937 and all of this.
Well, prior to the war, the Nazis embarked on a campaign to gather what they called degenerate art, which was art that was created by people who were considered enemies of the state, which, you know, Catholics, Jews, blacks, Freemasons, you name it. But they also used this policy to basically capture and seize objects that would be valuable to the government in funding the anticipated war effort. And they were seizing objects from German citizens, not just people who were enemies of the state. And some of the objects were collected and kept. Hitler had a huge stolen art collection. Hermann Goering, his second in command, did as well. But some of the choicest pieces that were of artistic importance but did not match the pro-Aryan agenda of the Nazis were put on display at a moving exhibition called the Degenerate Art Exhibition. And these objects were intentionally curated and hung in an unflattering way. And written on the wall when you walked in was
like
a German
shit,
equivalent of a phrase, saying, this is the sort of thing we are saving your children from. And it was meant to parade around things that the Nazis found objectionable. However, they also recognized that though they found them objectionable, that there was a market for them. So they were
because this was put up next to the Great German Art Exhibition, was like all the Aryan statues and shit.
Yeah, there was the good is
the good one and then the bad one, and then there's the dichotomy. But you're saying secretly, like, this was actually like a marketing tour to like drum up interest in the shit that they planned to sell afterwards?
It was more afterwards. I don't think it was intended for marketing, but what happened was the
effect, right? Like
yes, absolutely. And it was clear that they were going to be getting rid of these things, and many artworks were destroyed. But quite hypocritically, they recognized that, you know, they shouldn't exist in our context, but if someone wants to pay us for them, they can. And so there was a series of auctions, and the most famous one you're mentioning was in Lucerne, Switzerland, where the objects were sold to anyone who wanted to buy, and there were a lot of American buyers, which is quite shameful. They knew where it was coming from. Superficially, paperwork was rigged, so it didn't look like it had been illegally seized from private citizens, but almost all of it had been. So there was only the most superficial veneer of subterfuge in terms of forging provenance for that auction house. Everyone knew where they were coming from, and some people just said this is too good a deal to pass up. And there was a concern that objects that weren't sold would be burned, and they did burn thousands of works of art that didn't sell, but they tried to sell them first. And they tried to sell them abroad, and a lot of Americans bought them.
Well, this raises another question of restitution, Noah. So let's go down the chain 3 or 4 ownerships later. piece of art is plundered by the Nazis or by, let's just use the example of the Nazis. The Nazis, go into the private art collection of a Jewish guy in, somewhere in Germany or Paris or wherever. They take his art, right? And then, it's sold off with what you've described as a veneer of authenticity on the first go, right? Like the buyer probably knows this is shady. Like this is probably stolen. Then it gets sold again a second time. And the second time, there's more provenance. And then it's like slightly more legitimate. Like the second buyer might honestly not know that this was stolen from a Jewish family. And then you go to a third and a fourth and a fifth buyer. You end up encountering this dilemma where the eventual, like a legitimate sale was made in which somebody paid a lot of money for something that they thought was real and they thought didn't have blood on it and they thought was, legitimately acquired. But in the painting's history, 2 or 3 or 4 ownerships ago, it was taken in an unscrupulous manner. And now it's hanging in, somebody's living room. So you end up with this very difficult question of restitution. Should the painting go back to the descendants of the Jewish person from whom it was stolen? Or because a legitimate sale was made, or it's past the statute of limitations, depending on the country. I don't know. I'm Jewish. My family, my grandmother was a German Jew. She fled Europe in the 30s. So I'm conflicted on this. It's a difficult question to answer. How do we go, or if it ends up in a museum, right? There's also the argument that it belongs in a museum because this painting, this Vermeer, or this whatever is so great that it would be a crime to keep it in someone's private collection, private living room, when it's so great that it should be on the public for everyone to see. But how do we go about thinking, what are some ways to think about restitution? I know there's no good answers.
Sure. It's complicated. Absolutely. There's a reason why most of the restitution cases began only in the internet era, so basically the mid-90s on. And that's because that was the first time that people could easily see where objects were without having to have the fortune of stumbling on them in some collection. And in most cases, the statute of limitations only begins when the victim's descendants become aware of the existence and location of the object in question. So this is seizure during a conflict, which is different from theft during times of peace. And they don't have the same statute of limitations involved. They may have it for a criminal trial, but this becomes a civil issue. So nobody's going to jail for it. But the question is a family that has it now, or a museum, legally obliged to return it to the descendants of the original owner? And it's complicated to do. There are lawyers that specialize only in this. But the descendants have to be able to demonstrate that the object was in their possession, and that it was removed during the Nazi period. This is the most frequent example, but there are also others with other people or other state factors removing it from private hands. So if they can, point to a photo of their great-grandmother's living room with this painting in it, and then point to the painting in a museum collection, then they have a very good case. Most of these cases are settled because museums don't want negative publicity. And there's a real phobia in the art trade of dealing with objects that have a question mark in their story during the Second World War. I worked briefly at Christie's, the auction house in London, and while I was there, I helped with the sale of the William Foyle book collection, rare books. He was the founder of a bookshop in London, and it was a 3-day sale with over 3,000 lots. And out of all of them, there was only one object that Christie's would not sell, and it was a single book with a Nazi stamp in it, because they didn't want to accidentally sell something that was going to be reclaimed. So if it's a civil issue, the descendants can bring a lawsuit against the holder of the object. Nobody's going to jail for it at that point, but they can go to court. Again, normally they'll settle. but they have to be able to demonstrate that the object in question was in their collection and that it did disappear during that questionable period. They don't usually have to know the exact terms of when it was taken and by whom. That's something that is often necessary for the restitution of archaeological objects that were taken and claimed as cultural patrimony to be restituted. But from the perspective of the buyer, each of those buyers of the object legally has to prove two things if obliged to do so in court. One is called due diligence and one is called good faith. And these are two legal terms. Due diligence basically means that you tried proactively to make sure that the object wasn't on any stolen works of art list.
Yeah.
That's relatively easy to do even if you don't try too hard, unfortunately, but that's step one. And you have to be able to prove a good faith purchase, meaning to demonstrate that you genuinely thought the object was legitimate, which again, it's very hard to catch someone who should have been doing this, who didn't. But those are the two terms you need to be able to demonstrate. So for restitution cases, I always think it's best to return them if it's demonstrable that they were looted or taken illegally during a conflict, particularly in the Second World War, which is so sensitive. But quite often you'll get a situation where some deal is made, like the object will go on long-term loan to a museum, or the object will be sold and museums have the opportunity to purchase it, and the purchase price is divided among descendants, something like that. So it's rare that objects are completely disappearing into someone's living room, never to be seen again.
Right. Nothing ever disappears. Or, I mean, do things disappear forever, or you think they always resurface?
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah. I have another book. I'm not sure if you're going to suddenly whip it out because you have it, but it's another book I published with Fiden called Museum of Lost Art.
Okay.
And things do disappear, sometimes forever, but sometimes, sometimes they come back almost miraculously. And that whole book is an illustrated history of lost art. Each chapter opens with the story of a famous work that was lost and was almost miraculously found again, as a point of entry into talking about objects that were actually more important when they existed than what happens to have survived, but for various reasons they were lost. Some of them, in art history, we have the term lost versus extant. Extant means we know the location. Yeah. Lost could be like anything else. It could be we know it was destroyed, we think it was destroyed, it was stolen. But what I like about the term lost is it implies that it could be found again. But just one example that comes to mind, there's one of two versions of Van Gogh's Portrait of Dr. Gachet was bought by a Japanese collector, and he said he loved it so much he wanted to be buried with it. And it hasn't been seen since he died. Now, hopefully he didn't literally mean that, and one of his friends said, it was just a figure of speech, but it's still missing. So, hopefully these things will resurface. If an object was stolen, it inevitably comes back to the surface at some point, but it may take a few generations. The only thing we don't want are objects actually destroyed. That's irrevocable. And that fortunately happens rarely, but it happens enough that there's some depressing stories related to it.
Fascinating. One thing you do write about, though, is wine forgery. And when I saw Sour Grapes for the first time and learned who Rudy Kurniawan was, I was like drawn into all this again because I'm all interested in like con men and impersonation and impostures. And I saw this film and I was like, wow, like this is sick. And, you've written this book on wine forgery. So I guess one question I have here is there any chance that like Rudy was innocent? Or I don't know, innocent. No one's ever innocent of anything, but like it just seemed curious. There were a lot of curious details about the Rudy Kurniawan story. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Rudy Kurniawan story and then some of the things we don't know about this guy?
Well, this is another one where In the Wine Forgers Handbook, I write mostly about Hardy Rodenstock.
Tell us about Hardy Rodenstock.
And so okay, this is one of the problems. Is there's so many of these case studies that one
I don't
can
mean to
easily
put you on the spot.
No, it's no problem. I've read about the Rudy Carniowan story, but I don't remember the details off the top of my head. The Hardy Rodenstock one is related to the so-called Jefferson Lafite bottles of wine, which were ostensibly from the 18th century, and they're bottles of Lafite that Thomas Jefferson had ordered when he was president. And there seemed to be an infinite number of these, and Hardy Rodenstock was a major character. He actually invented the concept of different shaped wine glasses for different types of wine. That was something that people hadn't done before. It was a marketing gimmick that he came up with, and he made a fortune with working with Riedel, the company that makes high-end glasses of wine. And he kept on selling these, usually one on the market at a time. He sold one to the heir of the Forbes family. He sold a couple to different millionaire wine collectors, all of them for at least 6 figures, which in the world of rare wines is significant. And one of the things that's complicated about it is that there are almost no people in the world who have ever tasted wine that comes from before the 18th century. Yeah. And so tasting it is really one of the only ways that you can authenticate it. But in tasting it, you're basically ruining the value by opening it, and then you're consuming the value by drinking it. So it was a complicated thing to authenticate. There's a wine expert named Michael Broadbent who was the leading expert in pre-1800 wines, who had tasted some of these and thought they were authentic. But there wasn't a big point of comparison. The case became an issue, and it was written up in a really fun book called The Billionaire's Vinegar. And it's a great story. One of the buyers got suspicious, and this is often how forgery cases begin. Investigations often happen after a purchase is made, when for some reason someone gets suspicious, a buyer, and launches their own investigation. And the buyer hired a former FBI agent to look into it, and they found it suspicious that Rodenstock seemed to have an infinite number of these Lafite Jefferson bottles that he kept on offering on the market periodically, and he would never say how many of them he had. He claimed that he had found them when in a property of his, he had found a false wall, and there was a case of them behind the false wall. Had been walled over in Paris, which is possible because a lot of valuable wine was hidden when the Nazis invaded Paris, because a lot of valuable wine was stolen by them, along with art and all sorts of things. And in the end, the FBI agent was able to determine Rodenstock's guilt because he found that from a forensic perspective, the engraving on the Jefferson Lafite wine bottles had been made with an electric dentist's drill, which did not exist, of course, when Thomas Jefferson was president. Right. So this was the big scandal prior to the Carniowan scandal. And this is the one that I wrote about primarily in this book, The Wine Forgers Handbook, which was fun to write. One of my favorite little fun facts that I didn't know about and is a little bit creepy is all organic material on the planet contains a radioactive isotope that did not exist on planet Earth prior to 1945 and only existed because of atomic bomb testing and the 2 atomic bomb explosions on Hiroshima and at the end of World War II. And this atomic isotope is radioactive. It doesn't harm people, but it's in all organic material that essentially grew after 1945. It's in all of us. It's in all the food we eat. And it's detectable in wine. And so if wine contains it, it means that it was made from grapes that grew after 1945. And there have been some very valuable 18th century bottles that contain this radioactive isotope that didn't exist on the planet at the time. So sometimes you come around these fun facts that's a little bit creepy that we're introducing new radioactive isotopes to the planet, but there you go.
Yeah, no, it's I just love this stuff. So, I mean,
yeah, me too. Great stories. I love these. I could listen to these stories indefinitely. Absolutely.
Is there a whole lot of overlap you find between wine forgery and art forgery? I guess wine is a form of art, but
there's overlap really only in the victims. There's a certain
rich people.
finite number of people. Yeah. The art critic Jerry Saltz once said he thinks there's probably only about 1,500 people on the planet who are really proactive players in buying art. And if you think about it, that's not very much. And they all
15?
know each other. 1,500.
Oh, 1,500. Yeah.
Worldwide, yeah. They all know each other. They're playfully or not so playfully competing to with their collections and demonstrating their wealth, conspicuous consumption at the highest, most elite level. And art is one of the things they go after, and rare wine.
Right.
And so there's overlap among victims. And there's large scale, like mass commercial wine fraud, just like there's mass commercial olive oil fraud. There's some actually. Okay, so the reason that I got to be well known is somebody wrote an article about me having founded this study of art crime as a field of study in a New York Times Magazine article, and he later wrote a book called Extra Virgin, which is about forgery in the olive oil world and how the olive oil is almost never what it claims to be. It can be, yeah.
What do you mean?
I mean, the difference between
how expensive is a bottle of olive oil? It's olive oil.
Well, it's going into mass quantities, and the mafia runs much of Italy's olive oil trade. And the difference in price between extra virgin olive oil or something labeled as such and normal olive oil is considerable. So it's not like you have a single bottle going for 100,000, but you might have a million bottles going for 20 each instead of when it actually should cost 5 each.
Yeah.
So there's also forgery for, mass commercial wine.
Yeah.
Much more often than there is like a rare bottle that costs $100,000, because frankly, people are going to look harder at a $100,000 bottle of wine and wonder, should I be paying this? But they're not going to really think twice if they go to the supermarket and they're going to pay $20 for extra virgin olive oil from Calabria in Italy. And they're not going to know that it wasn't like cold pressed and there's actually only like 60% olives and this sort of thing. Not many people will know about that. So yeah, the forgery is everywhere. But I mean, we see that on social media. We see it in like political campaigns. We see it, every aspect of life. There are frauds taking place. Sometimes we're good at spotting them. Sometimes the committers of the fraud are basically too clever for us, and only a real specialist would be able to spot it. But it's a part of human nature to try to swindle people. Yeah. Some people do it for money. That's usually the outcome. Some people do it because they get an adrenaline rush from doing so. But for me, as long as I'm not the one being swindled, I think it's fascinating, and I love reading about it and writing about it.
Yeah, it goes back somehow to the Schadenfreude thing. Yeah. Well, I mean, especially when it's when the person on whom the joke is laid is somebody that has very little in common with us, like some gazillionaire person.
Exactly.
The olive oil thing, fascinating.
Yeah, check it out.
Who would investigate olive oil? Next time I go to Woolworths, which is the largest supermarket chain in Australia, I'm going to demand to speak to the manager. I got my blonde Karen hair, and I'm going to say, I would like to see the provenance of this olive oil. And she is going to say, what are you talking about? And I'm going to make a big fuss. I'll get escorted out, probably banned. But you know what? It's for the integrity
It's,
of the
it's for the
olive
greater
oil.
good.
It is for the greater good. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Noah.
My pleasure. Have a good one.